Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon in Estonia. It's about 5:45 in the morning here, so there wasn't a lot of traffic getting into work. It's an honor to be part of your conference and to talk about the work that we have done here in Duluth, and hopefully it has some relevance to work that you're trying to accomplish in your communities. So. Let's get right into it. Jeff, you want to bring up the first slide, please? Oh, yes.
Nice.
Okay. There we go. All right. So the model that you may have heard of before, the Duluth Model, is a way of organizing that we developed in Duluth to develop interventions around the problem of domestic violence. And at its foundation, the Duluth Model uses the lived experience of those that we serve, victims, as a way to develop interventions. So, for example, if we're going to develop a new child protection protocol or a new law enforcement policy, one of the first things that we do is we organize a series of focus groups with victims to ask them, when this government agency intervenes in your life, what are the things that they do that improve your safety or meet whatever it is that you called them for, right? So if you called them for help, did they help, right? Because if there's something that they're doing that the women don't want to lose, then we want to preserve that, right? But then what are the things that they do as an agency that make it less safe for you, right? And then we take that list of items that we get from victims and we bring it back, and in partnership with government agencies, we develop protocols and policies so that it helps practitioners consistently respond to, in a particular way, the way that victims need them to, across an entire community, right? So how do you get 250 police officers, for example, in a community to respond in a similar way, given a similar set of circumstances, right? And the way that we've found to do that is to develop policy, which says this is what you will do, and protocol, which says this is how you will do it. So when we put those two things together, it gives the frontline worker, whoever that is, law enforcement, child protection, probation, prosecution, it gives the practitioner a way of knowing how to execute their job linked to the lived experience of the victims that you're trying to serve. Next slide, Jeff. So one of the things within a coordinated community response is that it has to be, everybody has to understand that if you're going to be coordinated, everybody's going to have to change something that they do, right? That includes community-based agencies or government agencies. Most agencies in a community have developed their own policies, their own protocols, and they decide how they're going to intervene given a particular case. And we call that siloing. Right? So in that silo, that agency operates in a particular way, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the next agency that does their work because it isn't linked to that. So in a coordinated response, what somebody like myself would do is go through each agency and make sure that the policies and the protocols that the first responder to this particular incident, could be 911 emergency services, right, that she calls for help, that agency has a set of policies and procedures that not only make it safer for the victim, not only make it easier to hold the offender accountable, but also position the next agency, which is law enforcement, to be better positioned to do the job we're asking them to do, right? So that each one of these agencies' policies and protocols are interlinked in a way to be mutually supportive of the other's work with those three different goals in mind. Next slide, Jeff. So battering and the crime of domestic violence. Battering is the political term in the United States that came out of the women's movement to name the particular kind of violence that we're all talking about. When those activists went to the state and said that we need to criminalize this behavior on the basis of the argument that the state's responsibility is to protect its citizens, and there's a whole group of citizens across each state that are not being protected, that are being harmed in their home. And so the way to remedy that would be to criminalize this particular behavior. The problem, of course, that within government agencies, they are an event-driven system. They want to know what happened on this date at this time and was a statute violated. Unfortunately, that doesn't tell us the context of the violence, which tells us whether or not it's battering, situational violence, or some other kind of violence with a different intent. We want to understand when it's intimate partner violence used to dominate an intimate partner, right? And so battering is that, but our laws say domestic violence or domestic assault, which means that in Minnesota, in the state I live in, under our statute, a prisoner with a cellmate in a prison who gets in a fight, that's a domestic assault under our statute. That's not why we're here to organize. So we need to have some ways of determining under our domestic assault laws what kind of domestic assault it is, because it goes to risk and it goes to danger for victims. Next slide, Jeff. So in our community, and this could be different in globally as we work around the world. For example, in Australia, instead of the word battering, it's going to be perpetrator. That's the political word that came out of their women's movement to name this kind of violence. But however you end up naming it, you don't want one term for all the violence that happens, right? Because violence is different in different circumstances, which means there's different ways of thinking about what justice means. So if somebody is beating somebody into submission, dominating what she thinks, what she feels, what she does, right? That's battering. Resistive violence is the violence that victims sometimes use in response to the battering that they are experiencing, okay? And that sometimes might be a crime, right? So if it's a crime, then there has to be a way for the community response to distinguish between the violence that he's committing to dominate somebody and what justice means for that person, and what the violence is being used by the victim and what justice means for that person if it was illegal. So for example, in Duluth, we had a case where a man had beaten this woman. There had been multiple calls to this house over time. She was bleeding from her eyebrows, her nose, her mouth. Her face was smeared in blood. When the officers got him under control and secured the scene, and she obviously felt safe because they had him under control, then she picked up a coffee cup off of the counter and threw it at him and hit him in the cheek in front of the officers, okay? And under our statute, that is not self-defense because she was not under imminent threat of injury or harm, right? That was a crime, right? So what tools then does the system have to make distinctions between the kind of violence that he was using and what kind of consequences and what justice means for that individual versus the woman who picked up the coffee cup and hit him in the cheek? Both individuals under our statute were charged with the exact same crime, misdemeanor domestic assault, okay? How do you make distinctions? That's why it's important within a coordinated response to have kind of a subheading under your domestic assault laws that distinguish the different kinds of violence that come out of this. And then everything else that happens under that statute is non-battering, right? And typically, that's not going to be an individual who poses an ongoing threat to whoever, wherever the violence went. which could be like, for example, two brothers fighting over a vehicle as to who gets to take it that night, right? That's a whole different circumstance than what we're all here organizing around. Next slide, Jeff. So again, our word for this particular form of violence, you may have a different word for this, but battering is ours, an ongoing patterned use of intimidation, coercion, violence to dominate an intimate partner, to take away her autonomy within that relationship. And it is an intentional effort to do that, right? This is not a one-time incident. This is how he conducts himself as a man in that house in relation to his partner. And this individual poses a high risk for reoffense because this is how he identifies himself as a man and what he gets to do and who she is as a woman and what he gets to do to her. Next slide, Joe. So in order for the rest of us to be able to do that, context is crucial, right? So we have to be able to collect enough information at the scene to know what kind of a case we have. So it goes beyond law enforcement going to the scene and collecting who the names of the parties, what each did that in that particular evening, and what harm was caused and what evidence was collected. It needs to go to include questions that get to the context of the relationship. So in our jurisdiction, what we've organized law enforcement to do is ask 5 particular risk questions of every victim to get context, right? What's it like for her to live with him, right? Beyond the incident tonight, right? How often does he intimidate you? Does he make you do things sexually that you don't want to do? Does he show up places that you didn't anticipate him being? Right? Does he contact you through social media in an unwanted way? All these different kinds of questions to get at some of the risk issues and the context issues to help us determine who are we dealing with here, right? And when we don't do that, it endangers victims because all we are concerned about as a community is documenting the violence that happened that night. Then oftentimes her violence, if she uses it, looks just like his violence, right? And everything looks the same. And it's not the same, right? His intent was very different than her intent, right? And that makes questions of justice, that brings up questions of justice and makes us think differently about how we're going to manage him and the ongoing threat that he poses, and her and the ongoing threat that she is under. Next slide, Jeff. So the power and control wheel, which many of you have probably have seen over the years, has been translated all around the world. This was a wheel that was developed here in Duluth in the 1980s. And that was in conversation with over 200 women. And basically the infrastructure of a coordinated response had been developed in Duluth. And men were beginning to be held accountable for what they were doing. The criminal system came back to our agency and said, if we're going to arrest and convict these individuals, then you need to do something in relation to offering them the ability to rehabilitate. What are you going to do with them, right? After we get done with them in our system, right? And so Dr. Ellen Pence, who started our agency, and other advocates sat down with over 200 women and asked them, if we get these guys in a group for 10, 15, 20 weeks at a time, what do you want us to talk about that would make your lives better? And women started talking about the different things that he was doing to get what he wanted from her. And eventually the word tactics came up, and they started kind of taking all of these things that the women were talking about and putting them into these different categories that are on this wheel. So when you look at the wheel, these tactics on the inside and the outside ring of physical and sexual violence, these are the tactics of oppression. So when you look around the world and you see people being oppressed, these are the tactics that end up getting used. Men who batter didn't invent these, right? They learned them from the culture in which they grew up, right? So these are tactics of oppression. These are the tactics that he uses in an intimate partner relationship to oppress and dominate his intimate partner. So the physical and sexual violence on the outside, what the women wanted people to know through this visual is that holds all these tactics together on the inside. So emotional abuse looks different in a relationship where there's no battering versus inside this system, right? Because inside this system, if he's emotionally abusive, she doesn't get to just defend her position. She also has to account for his capacity to be violent and know what he's done in the past. And ultimately, what the women said is that it gives him power and control over me when he does this, right? And so in a coordinated response, if we're going to be effective, everything that we do, every policy, every protocol that we develop, both in the community rehabilitation or in government criminal justice responses, has to account for the power difference that he's established over her, right? As one woman in a focus group said to me, whatever you develop in your interventions that you're trying to put together, one of the things that you need to do is account for the power he has over me. Because the minute you stop doing that, then I disappear. Because as a victim, I never get to ignore the power he has over me. Neither do you, basically was her charge to us, right? So that really brought it home for me as an organizer in developing these community responses, to never lose sight of the power he has over, and then build that into our responses. So for example, law enforcement going to the scene. When an officer in Duluth goes to a domestic assault, they are not to interview the victim in front of the offender, right? Because of the power he has over her. If the officer wants good evidence, then the officer is going to interview that victim outside of earshot of that offender, right? That makes it safer for her. It makes it easier to hold him accountable, right? And it makes it better for the practitioner, because if the practitioner gets better evidence, there's more ability to hold him accountable, which means that there's an opportunity to rehabilitate, which means that you've dropped somebody off of your caseload, that you're not going to go back to this house time and time again to try and to deal with a family where the violence is ongoing. That's the hope, and that's the opportunity. Next slide, Jeff. So again, to understand how to coordinate a response, you have to understand the problem, right, that we're intervening in. There's typically an element of entrapment. You can't leave me without being punished. The most dangerous thing, according to the research in the United States, and I'm guessing most countries that I go to, is a victim attempting to leave an offender. No other risk factor comes close to putting her at risk of losing her life than trying to get away from a batterer. Account for the power differential created by the violence, and it shapes all interactions, right? So when a prosecutor says to me, well, these victims are really hard because they never want to testify. Okay, that's the landscape. That's just how it is, right? If you want to be a domestic violence prosecutor or prosecute domestic violence cases, then that has to be where you begin, because the majority, at least in the United States, of victims who report to police will recant that testimony within days or weeks after the arrest to the prosecuting authority and say, this didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way I said it happened. Right? That's just what happens, right? So then you have to help prosecutors develop strategies to deal with that reality, right? So rather than getting frustrated at the victim, understand that the power he has over her is influencing her recantation of the evidence, right? So then somebody like me can come in who testifies as an expert witness and explain why victims would do that to a jury or to a judge so that they have context for what's happening in front of them, that she isn't actually lying, right? Or women don't lie about this. They tell the truth oftentimes to law enforcement when they arrive, and they often recant that afterwards, right? Vulnerability to continued acts of violence influences the victim's ability to speak freely, leave the relationship, or participate in system interventions. Now, if you just take these 3 bullets here, and if these ideas were built into the policies and protocols in a community's response, you can just begin to see how much less judgment there would be against victims, right? And how hard they are to deal with because they don't tell me the truth. They don't follow through on what we're asking them to do. They lie on the stand, right? These are all products of fear. These are all products of the power he has over her, right? So if we can't see that in our coordinated response, then we don't deal with it, and we actually make it easier for offenders to do what they're doing. Next slide, Jeff. So again, within that system, and often in a rehabilitation program, we represent the system that these men create by this triangle. Domination or oppression is at the top, and he is pushing down on her, trying to get her to do what he wants her to do, or stop doing something that he doesn't want her to do, and she will resist. And that resistance has a whole continuum of what it looks like, from illegal behavior to legal behavior, up into including homicide, right, against her intimate partner. All of that resistance is on a continuum. We as practitioners have to understand that continuum. We have to understand this triangle, right? This isn't a relationship problem, right? Men who batter don't do it because she doesn't follow through on what she's committed to, or she's late for work, or she's late getting home, or the dinner isn't right. None of that justifies beating her into submission, right? That's a problem he has individually and apart from the victim. And we, again, in our coordinated response, have to build that in to how we develop policy and protocol and ultimately the behavior of our frontline workers. Next slide, Jeff. So resistive violence, as I said, includes both legal and illegal violence. If it is self-defense in the United States under our statutes, there's no crime. And officers need to be guided to assess for that. If it is illegal violence, then we need, back to the previous slide, we need context. We need to understand the context of her life with this individual. And if we know that, we are better positioned to make decisions about justice and what it means for her going forward. Because if you sit in a room with either juveniles or women who've been arrested for domestic assault against somebody who's been committing ongoing violence against them, they will tell you time and again that we give him more power when we arrest and convict her, right? Because he will now use the criminal system as a way to get her to submit to what he wants. He doesn't have to raise his hand anymore because all he has to do is threaten to report her behavior to her probation agent, and then she gets rearrested, right? So you're going to have sex with my friend in front of me because that's what I want you to do. No, I don't want to do that. Well, then I'm just going to call your probation officer and tell you you've been drinking, right? That's an example of what we've heard from women about how he uses that arrest against her. Because he doesn't stop doing what he's doing because she's been arrested. He's continuing to do it. He just has another tool, right? So we have to approach these cases with care and how we litigate them in order to make sure that we don't give him more power over her than he already has. Next slide, Jeff. So when we're talking to victims in focus groups about their ways of dealing with his violence, they try to negotiate with him. They appeal to family and friends to talk to him about what he's doing. They appease, they submit to what he wants to avoid the violence. They have tremendous amounts of anger, hostility, and resentment that they carry about him. They try to separate, withdrawal, and they use force. These are all different ways and strategies that women in our focus groups have talked about dealing with his violence. This is not a list by any stretch that you will find interviewing men who batter. They don't negotiate. They don't bring anybody in. In fact, they isolate her from her family and friends. They don't submit to anything she wants. That's not who they are. This is a different list because you've got a different person who may have committed a crime. And again, if we want to help this person, right, who's doing these kind of things, we have to have a different kind of intervention than we use for somebody who's been arrested for domestic assault, who's trying to dominate their partner, right? Different interventions because you've got different individuals with different intents behind their violence. Next slide, Jeff. So most of the violence that women experience and the abuse that they experience is coercive control. The violence establishes his ability to coerce her into submission. So once she knows that he's capable of being violent, then he doesn't have to actually use physical violence most of the time to get what he wants. So on the power and control wheel, these in purple are typically the tactics that are associated with coercive control. Although what women will tell us is that coercive control actually underlies his use of all of these different tactics, including the violence, right? That it becomes the main way that he uses, the main tactic that he uses to emotionally abuse her, to isolate her, to use the kids, to intimidate, to control the money. All of that has an element of coercion in it once he's established himself as a threat to her through the violence that he's used. Next slide, Jeff. And again, this is a quote from Evan Stark, who is a U.S. author and wrote a book called Coercive Control. Basically took all of that research and that women's activists have been doing for years and encapsulated into a book which verified that the vast majority of abuse that women experience is coercive control once he's again established himself as a threat to her. Next slide, Jeff. So in establishing coercive control, becomes a threat to her physical, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Somehow he is a threat to her faith family if she goes to church, to her career, to her own physical safety, or use the children and the threat to the children to emotionally abuse her. I will do this to the kids if you don't do what I want you to do. Once he's done that, then he identifies her needs and attachments, right? The things that she's strongly attached to. Again, her career, her church, her friends, her extended family, her children, all of those things she has strong attachments. He notices this, right? And he will use those attachments as a way to leverage. So then once he sees what those are, then he restricts, depletes, or destroys her connection to those, to family, to friends, to her children, right? So when we did a series of focus groups through our family visitation center, where families do exchanges or visits when there's domestic violence going on, one of the things that women talked about that was even surprising to us was the amount of sexual coercion that was happening at unsupervised exchanges of children. So he would have the kids in his car. He was supposed to have returned those kids a month ago. She hasn't seen the kids, depletes her attachments, right? Kept the kids for over a month. Now he shows up at a fast food restaurant parking lot to hand over the kids, tells the kids to stay in the car. Well, he gets out of the car, goes into her car, and asks for her to perform a sexual act on him before he will give the kids back. And if she doesn't do it, then he drives away with the kids, right? So what the women said is that when I take him to court and I complain about this, they say, well, call the police. So they call the police, and the police say, this is a civil matter, right? Go back to court. So she's stuck in between these systems that don't respond to what he's doing, and he basically gets what he wants, right? Because we as a community have left her on her own to deal with him. And then intermittent episodes of violence to remind her that this is what he's capable of doing, so the coercion continues to work. Next slide, Jeff. So any system we want to build, any coordinated effort we want to build, we have to understand the experience of victims. In every community around the world, victims experience these different tactics that we've talked about. However, how they experience those tactics, how men who batter leverage those tactics, given the different communities that they live in and the resources available to them and the collusion that the community gives him to do what he does, all looks different, right? So in the military, these tactics, they use these tactics, but he can use his rank as an officer against his partner, who's also a member of the military, against her in the home, right? So he doesn't call her by her name, he calls her by her rank when he wants her to submit to what he wants, right? So again, as you go around the world, you find different ways in which men exercise these tactics, given the resources they have to do so within the community. That's why I can't tell you, for example, what would be best for Estonia, because I don't know what the women in Estonia would say in a series of focus groups about how he gets what he wants, how he exercises these tactics against her, because that will then dictate how your community response should be organized to respond to what he's doing, right? You also need to know the characteristics of abusive men, how they present in an intervention, right? So an officer knocks at the door. Man answers the door and says, what seems to be the problem, officer, right? Now, 2 minutes before, he was throwing his partner and the Christmas tree across the room. And immediately, when the knock on the door happens, he is calm and cool and collected. And when I interviewed this particular individual about that behavior, I said, how did you go from that level of violence to basically, what seems to be the problem, officer? And he said, because I didn't believe I got to do that to police. I got to do that to her. She was mine. I get to do what I want with her. But I don't get to do that to the police, right? So I wasn't out of control. I was completely in control of myself, right? So that helps us understand, right? There's things that practitioners on the front line, like law enforcement, it's confusing to them, kind of the things that they see, right, when they go to a scene, right? But if we understand how these men operate, we understand who they are and how they're put together, socially constructed to be who they are, then we have a better way of seeing through this behavior and dealing with it. And then we can design interventions that work, right? Because we're linked to the lived experience of those we serve, both those who are offending and those who are victims. Next slide, Jeff. So that is a quick analysis of the problem that now informed what we did with it, right? So next slide, Jeff. So you've got a woman who calls for help, right? Her and her kids are subjected to this violence and they call for help. And these are all the different ways in our jurisdiction, the systems that a woman will call into. Now, when she calls 911 for help, she doesn't know she's calling into a social service response, into a possible family court response, into a housing response, into a criminal response, and all the things that are going to be asked of her. All these different systems have their own institutional timelines, and those get imposed on her. And when that level of imposition happens to many victims, they pull out. They just quit, right? Because she's also has a timeline for her life and her life with her children, right? And now she's got to meet all these different institutions, dates, times, and requests for information. Very few of these systems will be calling her to tell her, this is what we can do for you. What they want is things from her, right? And then she just opts out. So if this is what she calls into, we are then obligated as those in the system to organize that process so that it's easier for her to navigate, less of an imposition, and still can hold him accountable and get her the resources that she needs. Next slide, Jeff. So in Duluth, that Duluth model approach, that method of organizing, which is really a 3-day training for us to talk about, develops what it develops is a coordinated community response. And within that coordinated community response, we have both government and non-governmental agencies who all are coordinated and work together for a common outcome through a common set of understandings and principles about the problem that we're intervening in, which gives us a consistent way of responding across the community. Next slide, Jeff. So these are the principles that we operate from, and I don't have the time to go into each one of these, but basically it's an adherence to an interagency approach, right? Every single government agency or community-based agency who is in our CCR understands that when they go to a domestic assault, they are not the only agency that's going to intervene in this case. That their work as an agency, as a law enforcement officer, that police report is going to be used by multiple agencies to make determinations about her safety, about his risk, and about how to manage both, right? Providing swift and sure consequences is another example. We understand in the United States from our research that providing swift and sure consequences to these individuals for this particular population of offender have impact, right? And has more impact typically than bigger consequences that take longer to get to, right? So again, that informs how we might want to develop violations of probation and how quickly we want to respond to those, or do we want to tag them to his reoffense, right? And then that means that this violation takes months to get to an end result, as opposed to an immediate sanction because he committed a new act of violence. Next slide, Jeff. Shared understanding. Again, all of our practitioners, there's 3 kinds of domestic violence. There's battering, there's resistive, and non-battering. So when I have a case in front of me as a prosecutor, which one of these is it? And if I know which one it is, then I have a different set of guidelines, protocols on how to intervene or consider factors in this case. The power of the state should be restricted to the controlling the illegal activity of the offender. Because she is being beaten by him, the state shouldn't be walking in and telling her what to do, right? The management of anybody, it should be the offender, right? Because when we start trying to manage victims, then victims get more marginalized in that system. Victims are rarely free to cooperate with the system and hold offenders accountable. We know that, right? Because of that power difference. So why expect it? Understand it, that's just part of the landscape, and then organize our systems to deal with that particular barrier to getting these cases dealt with. Account for the power differences, which we talked about, and batterers are responsible for stopping their violence, period. It's not a relationship problem. It's not an alcohol problem, right? This is how he's been socially constructed to think about himself as a man. We have to hold him accountable and then find a way to help rehabilitate how he's been socially constructed, how he's learned to be the kind of man that he is. Next slide. So that leads to the coordinated community response. And a coordinated response, under our definition, isn't just organizing all these agencies in a particular way. It's also to do it in a way that changes the climate of tolerance for this crime in the community. So I can't tell you how many times a guy who's been living in someplace, another state or another part of Minnesota, moves to Duluth, gets arrested for domestic assault, gets processed very differently than what they've ever experienced before, and then they come into men's group at the very end of this thing, rehabilitation, and they say, where I lived before, nobody cared. But now that I moved to Minnesota, right, which is their sarcastic way of referring to this state, because we don't tolerate your violence, right? If you raise a hand to her and she calls for help, we will be relentless in our pursuit of you and giving you opportunities to change. And if you don't, there are consequences that will follow. We want men to have a conversation in our community that this isn't going to be tolerated if you do it, right? And in communities that I've been to where this isn't the case, I can tell you they are having conversations with each other saying the police aren't going to do anything. They'll arrest you, but nothing happens. You'll get off with a slap on the wrist, right? There's no consequence. If there's no consequence, you will not stop this violence. You will not stop this violence. All right, next slide. So basically, quickly, here's how a case would get processed. A victim would call 911 for help. 911 has a particular protocol on how to engage that victim. And for example, if the offender gets on the phone, right, to keep him on the phone. Why is that helpful? Evidence, right? He's talking. He's giving information and putting it on a recording, right? So keep him on the phone. Second thing, one of 911's responsibilities is to make sure that law enforcement knows what they are walking into, right? If he's on the phone and you know where he is in the house, then law enforcement has a leg up. They know where he is. They know he's on the phone. They know what room he's in, right? That makes it safer for officers who are walking into that scene, right? That's just one example of something you'd build into a 911. Law enforcement, you're not just writing this police report for the prosecutor. You're also writing it for the men's program. You're writing it for Child Protective Services. You're writing it for probation, who are determining pretrial release conditions or post-conviction sanctions, right? Everybody's using this police report for different reasons. So everybody has to have a hand in what gets collected at the scene, because that report now is going to stand in for the victim for the rest of this case. And if law enforcement didn't collect the evidence at the scene, at least in our jurisdictions here in the United States, it's very hard to get things back into the case. Basically, it doesn't exist. Advocacy needs to be able to have access to this information so they can provide the best service to the victim. The jail, we don't want to send guys to jail who were trying to rehabilitate, but we want them to understand that if they commit these crimes, that could be one of their consequences. So in Duluth, they would get arrested at the scene, they would get brought to jail, they'd probably do 2, maybe 3 days in jail before they get processed for their first hearing in a court. But before that individual is released from jail, the jail is required to call the victim and let the victim know that on this time, on this date, he will be released from jail. So she can make decisions about what she needs to do to make sure she's safe, right? So he just doesn't show up at her door because the jail let him out. Our domestic violence response team puts together a risk analysis of every arrest of a domestic violence offender. That risk analysis by 9:30 a.m. every morning goes to the prosecutor, the judge, and to probation pretrial release, so that everybody making a decision on a case is making it from the same basis of information. The prosecution victim witness, when does victim witness contact the victim? How do they talk to her? Are they clear that things that the victim tells the victim witness coordinator, in our jurisdiction at least, is not confidential, right? So is the victim being given informed consent, right, to give information to the victim witness coordinator, who's going to tell everything that victim says to the prosecutor, right? Or are you just not telling that to the victim and using the victim basically as a tool to convict him, right? Probation, then if the individual's convicted, then they take on that supervision of that individual. They make sure that he is where he's living. Is he working or not working? Is he following the orders of the court and the limitations that he has as far as victim contact? Is he getting into rehabilitation? Does he need chemical dependency treatment? Does he need mental health assessment? Right? All of those things are done by our probation department to make determinations about these individuals prior to putting them out to community agencies for whatever help he might need. If you go to our website and you go to this link that I've got at the bottom of this slide, you can see all of our law enforcement, all of our criminal justice policies and protocols for every one of our agencies. You can see what we've developed given our laws and our jurisdictions and what we ask and require of all these different government agencies when they respond, and see how these policies and protocols are interconnected and build on one another. Next slide, Jeff. All right, so I'm trying to make sure that I leave enough time for questions, so I may go through these slides a little quicker here. Basically, the activities of a coordinated community response: discover the problem in the system's response, right? And not the only way, but the primary way that you discover problems in the system is by having ongoing conversations with victims about how the system is responding, right? That is crucial. So here's a quick example. Prosecutors needed to know whether the victim was intoxicated or not at the scene when she gave testimony to the officer, because defense attorneys were using that to discredit victims' testimony in the cases, right? So this would be a way to deal with that. So we built it into the protocol that officers are asking this question. What we found after we implemented it, right, is that Native American indigenous women who were being asked that question by white officers were taking that question as an insult to them. White women asked that question by white officers weren't taking it the same way. So it was the same question, but it was landing very differently depending on who was being asked, right? So we had to go back to law enforcement and redesign how they asked that question, so that we could account for how it was being interpreted when asked without context by the officer to a woman who's indigenous, right? That would be an example of that ongoing listening to victims about how the system is or is not helping them when they call for help. Organize with agencies to solve those problems using victim experience as a starting point, and then track the impact of those interventions to see if the results match the desired intent. Essentially, that is the work of a CCR, ongoing, right? Once you build it, there's an ongoing way of making sure that it's doing what you intended, and then you're always going to find things that you didn't find when you first were developing it. It's like an onion skin, right? You take the outer layer off, you can't see the next layer until you take the next layer off, right? And then the same thing happens again and again and again. You just see more as you organize more. So it's always an ongoing effort. Next slide. We organize for safety and accountability, policy, protocols, and practices that are consistent with our organizing principles and shared understandings. We investigate possible unintended consequences towards those who are victimized. I just gave an example of that. Account for the social conditions and culture in which victims experience the violence, right? So a woman in a strong Christian community, oftentimes those women in our community don't call government for help. They call their pastor, right? That's their 911 for help. So we have to then organize with pastors in order to make sure that they have a way of thinking through and responding to these so that it doesn't make it worse for victims when that's their call for help. And then respect for practitioner discretion in these cases. We don't make policies and protocols that take away discretion. We want to, obviously, there's no way in every single case that we could come up with a policy and protocol that would cover everything that's going to be in front of an officer, for example, at a scene. We have to be able to trust in their professionalism and their discretion in these cases. What we're doing with policies and protocols is positioning that officer to do a consistent job at the scene and position them to get the best evidence and not make it worse for the victim when they do so. Next slide, Jeff. Essentially, the work of a CCR is making the violence visible. What did he do to her with what impact, right? Who's doing what to whom with what impact? Essentially, you're making that visible so that the system can understand who's in front of them, the risks that they pose, and what needs to happen to this individual to be rehabilitated. Next slide, Jeff. This gives you a quick kind of, again, we'd spend a lot more time on this if we were doing a longer training, but this is essentially you identify the problem, right? And typically the victims and focus groups will give you the problem, but you don't know why the problem exists. So then you have to go back and do all kinds of interviews, observations, look at policies, look at protocols to see how did this problem that the women are talking about get created by how people are organized to do their jobs, right? So you know what the problem is, but you don't know why it happens. So that takes some work. You identify the sources of the problem, and then you approach decision makers at these different agencies for possibilities on how to change that. And then you sit down in work group meetings and you start developing these solutions, writing protocols, writing drafts, right, of these things that you go back and check with command and see if these things are going to be adopted. And if so, promote it, train on it, implement it, and then follow up like I talked about to make sure that the intent behind it is actually happening in the community. What you wanted to have happen is actually a result. Next slide, Jeff. And then in Duluth, we have a way of ongoing evaluation of our coordinated response. And so we don't parse out the police response or the men's program individually, because I don't think that's possible, because every one of these steps has how a case gets processed has an influence on his capacity for reoffense. So we look at individuals who go through our entire CCR, which means all the way through the men's program, or go through part of it, and may end up getting violated and then sent to jail to do their time. So what we know basically is that when we take these offenders and we follow them 8 years from their last point of contact with the system, which is typically probation, 7 out of 10 of these guys will not be back in our civil or criminal system 8 years from the last point of contact with the system. And reoffense to us means an arrest, not a conviction. Just an arrest would be enough for a reoffense under how we analyze this data. And then we have a civil order for protection that can get implemented. And if one of those is granted in civil court, then that's also counted as a reoffense. And so what the system, one of the reasons our criminal system is supports the work that we've been doing for 40 years here in Duluth is because we take a lot of offenders off the caseload, right? So this response that we've developed in Duluth reduces the amount of individuals that law enforcement have to respond to on the court docket, on the probation rolls, right? If we did not do this, we would have significantly more people being arrested, times, how many times officers have to go to the house, how many people are on a judge's docket, or how many people probation is supervising. So they have a buy-in. Victims are safer because men are not committing these acts of violence again. A lot of men aren't. It's not obviously for all men. And our community is safer, and that's the goal, right? And offenders understand that this isn't going to be tolerated, right? If you continue to commit these kinds of acts of violence. All right. So I think that is the end. Is it, Jeff? Last slide. Yeah. Okay. So Jeff, you could just take the PowerPoint down if you want, and I'd be open for questions from anybody. And I can't see anybody.
Hello,
right now,
hello,
so
Scott. Do you listen us?
Yes, yes. Oh, there we are. Okay, now I can see.
How can the police identify coercive control? How can we really help victims on coercive control?
That's a great question.
Most popular question.
Yeah. So in the United States, we have not done a good job of figuring that out. In England, they have criminalized coercive control, and they've been doing it, I think, for 4 years now. And so they've got some case history. Nicole Westmoreland, who's a researcher in England, has done some work on this. And so the practical matter of it, she would be a great resource for it. But under our statute and our Constitution, there's barriers to that in our particular country. The other concern that a lot of advocates have is that women will be held to some of these coercive control laws if they're passed. So there's a lot of debate. This is a new emerging part of the work. So I wish I had a great answer for you, but I don't at this time. Okay. I hope the answer was given. Okay. In some cases, victims of battering stay together with the violent partner, sometimes even after conviction. What is your suggestion for specialists working with these kind of cases? Yeah. So again, if we know that for victims, it's leaving, if that's what they're going to do, is a process, right? It's not an event. It's not just going to happen because he got arrested. When I've sat down with and talked to women in focus groups about this particular question, what I hear a lot of is that the first time he got arrested, it felt like it was our fault. It felt like I did this thing and he did this thing and we got into this struggle and he apologized and we shouldn't have done it. But then the next time he got arrested, I started thinking, well, all right, so this has happened twice now. I'm the one who's being hurt, but he's the father of my children. I don't want to break up the family. I don't want my kids to be without their dad, right? But then the third time it happened, I began to realize that this is just how he is. Like, this is going to keep happening as long as, right? So it's this way that women think about their relationship, their commitment to it, his violence, why it happened. All of that comes into play. And the other piece to this is that he's just not being violent to her, but part of his ability to control her is to control how she thinks about the problem. So all along, one way to think about it is that he colonizes her mind, right? So if you're an advocate and you sit down with a victim who's just got out of, come into shelter, what we hear often from victims is his words coming out of her mouth. Her interpretation of the problem is the interpretation that he's been giving her, right? And so that makes it difficult for her to separate what she wants to do versus how he is kind of taken over how she thinks about both the family, what her role is, and her commitment to the relationship. So all of these things, and then the fear of leaving, right? All of that stuff builds and makes it very difficult for victims to leave. So again, if we understand that and we understand the particulars of it in any given community and what that looks like, then we have a better way of intervening not only on her behalf, but on his. Okay, the last one. Do probation officers in USA receive special training about domestic violence and ways to support victims? Yes, they do. So They receive it. I think the State Department of Corrections does some of that training, but then also within our community, we also do some of that training so that we're helping them understand how to talk to offenders, how to challenge them in the way that they think, what motivates them, what doesn't motivate them. And one of the best ways that we have found to develop expertise, and I don't care if it's a prosecutor, a judge, a probation agent, a police officer, when you specialize in domestic violence cases. So in Duluth, we have a probation department that has agents that do nothing but domestic assault cases. When they first start those, they struggle. They have a hard time talking to victims. They have a hard time talking to offenders because they don't understand who they're talking to, right? But as through the training and then through the practice, right? Lots of practice having conversations with victims, they begin to understand the problem, and they get really good at dealing with offenders and victims because they do it. That's what they do. That's what they're organized to do. So specialization rather than general caseloads really can position practitioners to do much better work than if they're dealing with every kind of case under the sun and domestic assault cases. One social worker said to me, in the morning, I have a neglect problem with a family, and then in the afternoon, I've got a mom who's addicted to drugs, and then I've got a dad who's sexually abused his kid, and then I've got a domestic assault case. And every single one of these different problems takes a different brain on my part, has a different way of intervening, right? What I do then as a practitioner is I just take one brain and deal with them all. And something gets lost in every one of those cases because I don't have a way of going from this problem to this problem to this problem. When I specialize, when I only have to have one way to think about the cases that I'm dealing with, that positions me to make better decisions in those cases. Specialization works. So that would be my answer to that question, is not just training, but specialization.
Scott, thank you very much for your presentation and expertise.